blogosphere, its relation to the mainstream media, what it's good at and what it's not so good at. We have two people to help us in person, and we've got two voices on the phone. Ben Hammersley is blogging at benhammersley.com. He's a former correspondent on multimedia for The Guardian, currently resides in Italy, does some consultation work with The Guardian, BBC, and others here in the UK. He's an authority on the blogosphere and has been there for a while. Also joined by Kevin Marsh, who's currently the editor at the BBC College of Journalism. He's also the ex-editor of the Today program on Radio 4. He's our mainstream media representative. Bit of a target today, I suppose, but I'm sure he's going to bring some interesting views. The people we have hooked up with us over Skype or the phone have also got some interesting viewpoints to bring. One of them is Ethan Zuckerman. Some of you may have encountered some of his work over the net. He's with, and I'm hoping I have the title right, Ethan will correct me, globalvoicesonline.org. He's also involved with the Berkman Center at Harvard University. Also is with the Open Net Initiative, which does lots of good work in countries where internet access is limited by governments who don't like the technology. I've said this before about Ethan, I'll say it again tonight. If you were the Chinese government, the Iranian government, or a representative of the Belarusian government, and you were looking for one irritant to take out, to get out of your way in order to bring the internet under your control, Ethan is a good place to start. But we won't say where he lives. Somewhere in western Massachusetts, I think it is. We're also joined...
with an introduction like that.
Say that again, Ethan?
With an introduction like that, we'll keep my location quite vague.
He's also a self-described geek and a terrific interview. We're also joined today by Ala Abdel El Fattah, who I believe joins us from Cairo, co-founder of a blog called Manala. I met him a few weeks ago in the Gulf. The Egyptian blogosphere is a very interesting place. It's a bit of a laboratory, I think, testing the limits of, in the Arab world, of how far governments will allow bloggers to go in a region where there's traditionally been a tight lid kept on expression. And the stakes are very high, as everybody knows, in Egypt. So I'm just going to give you a short introduction from my point of view, and then we're going to start with Manala, because there have been news developments this week from the blogosphere in Egypt. I do a broadcast at Al Jazeera called The Listening Post, which is a media broadcast. And 18 months ago, when we pitched this broadcast, or in the 18 months between when we pitched it and Al Jazeera finally got on the air, we had an idea originally of what this media broadcast was going to look like. We thought it would be a global multimedia version of What the Papers Say. And in that 18-month span, everything changed. And the broadcast that we envisioned then and the one that we're putting out now are two completely different beasts. And that's primarily because of all the developments in the blogosphere. We saw that as being a small part of the story when we originally pitched the show. Every week now, we're looking at developments in the blogosphere, and particularly how they're pushing mainstream media. And so we found some fascinating developments there. What I want to do is start with perhaps Ben giving us a few words on, by way of introduction, if you could keep it short. I'll ask Kevin to do the same thing. And perhaps, Ethan, you can come to us with an introduction. And then I'm going to have a question from Manala about some developments this week in Cairo. Ben?
It's really difficult to, thank you very much. It's really difficult to know where to start this topic, so I will be very, very brief, and we'll get into the sort of discussion of it. I think the key thing that we're going to be talking about over the next half an hour or so is the result of a technological revolution, which can be really simply summed up as free tools to express yourself to as many people as possible. When people talk about blogging, the conversations always get very, very complicated very quickly, because there are for every blogger there's a different style of blogging. There isn't one blogging, there's 50 million bloggings. And the common denominator of that is free or very, very cheap, very easy to use tools on the internet to express yourself. And this has an awful lot of very interesting implications. But at its very heart, there is no such thing as blogging. There are just blogging tools and then lots and lots of people using them.
Kevin, I know that you've got some thoughts on what the blogosphere is up to, and I suspect, like many people, you see some limitations in what the blogosphere can actually do for us.
Yeah, I think if there was one point that I really want to emphasize this evening, the thing that worries me mostly, and I am coming, as you say, Rich, from the point of view of, I suppose, traditional media, it's that the claims that are being made, particularly in mature democracies, for blogging, for the blogosphere, the claims are being made about it and on its behalf as a tool to mend politics and to mend political journalism. I think those claims are unachievable. And I think it's actually quite dangerous to think that the solution to our politics lies in the civil conversation that blogging, and for that matter, a broken political journalism underpins. So my anxiety here, I guess, is, or to put it, to start in a different place, it would clearly be insane on World Press Freedom Day to think that there should be or could be or ought to be any limitations to people's ability and the tools that they can use to express themselves. Of course it would. And obviously you remember on a day like this the price that some journalists like Alan pay for supporting the freedom to report from dangerous places. What concerns me, though, is the disconnect that I don't think the blogosphere reconnects between the civil conversation, the conversation we have with each other, and the formal way in which we do our politics, particularly in mature democracies. So that's the one thing probably I want to get across, that political journalism is broken, politics are broken in mature democracies, I think, quite seriously so. And I don't think blogging is the tool that can mend it.
There have been many areas where bloggers have contributed in the political discourse. I don't think civility is one of them. Ethan, by way of introduction, do you want to pick up on the fact that today is World Press Freedom Day?
Absolutely. Let me build on that a little bit, and let me just say, on a technical note, I'm sort of feeding back on myself in a terrible way, which makes this a little tough to talk. But one of the things that we're very interested in about the potential for blogging with Global Voices Online doesn't really address Kevin's concerns about mature democracies. We're much more interested in blogging as a way to give you ideas and opinions, not necessarily just journalistic writing, but the whole wealth of citizen media writing from developing nations. And what I think is particularly important to note on World Press Freedom Day is that in a lot of countries, the blogosphere is at present a much less constrained sphere of information than the press or the broadcast media. If you're looking to get a sense for what people in Zimbabwe are thinking and doing, it's very, very difficult to get that out of the highly controlled broadcast media or even out of the nearly as highly controlled press. Whereas there are a number of voices, some of them anonymous, some of them speaking under their actual names, giving quite interesting perspectives on what's happening on a daily basis in Harare or in Bulawayo. So I think it's worth noting that this new space is in many cases a space for freedom of expression, especially in countries where there is some constraint on press freedom. I also would note that that openness of this space appears to be closing, and closing quite rapidly. My colleagues at Open Net Initiative were following 4 countries in the world that were filtering the net 5 years ago. They're now following 24. And if we see that trend increasing, we're likely to see this new free space of the blogosphere and of citizen media become roughly as constrained as other media spaces are in developing nations at present.
Thank you, Ethan. Sorry about the feedback if you're getting it. Just to let you know, you're coming through here loud and clear. I'm going to turn to Alaa Abdel El Fattah now,
whom we lost.
who we have lost.
Yeah. So
Okay. We'll go to him in a few minutes because in this week there was another casualty in the Egyptian blogosphere. So the signs there aren't very good. We'll see if we get him now. Otherwise...
Hello.
Hello, Allah, it's Richard Gisbert in London. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. I couldn't hear anything in the beginning.
Okay, so you missed the introductions, but that's okay because we were all boring. Allah, I wanted to start with you, and I'd like to have a few words of introduction from you on blogging. You know, we did talk in Qatar recently, but I wanted to start with the news we heard just the other day that one of the better-known bloggers in Egypt, who goes under the name of Sand Monkey, has decided to pack it in. And he wrote on his blog that following the arrest of Karim Amr, who was jailed for 4 years, ostensibly for insulting Islam, but really he was very tough on the Mubarak government, and he was the first blogger to be sentenced and convicted. And Sand Monkey said on his blog that he felt that security was closing in on him and that he thought that his anonymity was about to be blown and he's going to get out of the game. I know that Sand Monkey wasn't everybody's cup of tea in Egypt, some of the things that he wrote, but I'm just wondering what thoughts you have there and what people like you are thinking insofar as how long they can continue to express themselves through this medium.
Yeah, okay, just a couple of corrections. I think Sand Monkey has said that the security concern is not his only reason. He's also feeling burned out and has some complaints about the blogosphere itself and certain personalities and egos and so on. And also about Abdel Karim, it's very debatable whether he was, I mean, I think he's in prison because of the Islam thing and not because of the government thing. But anyway, it looks grim at the moment. We have two bloggers in prison, Abdel Karim and Abdel Mahmoud. We've had in the past 2 years several bloggers who have been harassed by security, being fired from their jobs through interference and things like that. This is not new. This is very normal in Egypt. It happens to journalists all the time. It happens to activists all the time. But and until recently, it was only happening to bloggers who were also activists, who were active beyond the internet. But it's starting to get. We're starting to be worried that the government is now attacking the medium itself, attacking just the notion of people expressing themselves about political problems, and also the religion taboo is, as we've seen with Abdel Karim, there are many different institutions and agents in Egyptian society, and I'd say in the Arab world in general, that would be interested in limiting the amount of freedom of expression that we have. The attacks have been focused on the individual blogger and not on the medium. So we are not seeing censorship yet, but we're seeing people being sent to jail or facing or facing trial on libel charges, or, as I said, being threatened in their livelihood. It's very difficult to say whether this is a trend that is going to continue, whether it will affect. It's really difficult to predict, but it is having a chilling effect at the moment.
Ethan, do you want to pick up on that? And afterwards, I think Ben might have something to add on this.
Let me jump in a little bit on this subject of chilling effect. There's at least two ways for governments to constrain the sort of speech that takes place in these spaces. And one is to try to technically constrain it. We're seeing that in countries like China. We're seeing it in Ethiopia, which is blocking access to blogger.com. Pakistan is doing the same. The other way to do this is to threaten the people who are using the medium. And when you threaten people who are using blogs, when you put them in prison, when you tell them that they're under surveillance, which is the technique being used in Zimbabwe right now, you really intimidate people who are using the space. So when you see someone like Sand Monkey decide to stop blogging, That's an intimidation effect, and it's an intimidation effect based on the fact that the Egyptian government has shown that there are real consequences for people who are choosing to speak using this medium. By arresting or threatening to arrest a couple of people, it's possible to silence sometimes hundreds of thousands of people who would otherwise choose to express themselves through this medium.
Anything to add, Ben?
I was sort of taking it on a little bit further. I think it's very interesting to ask yourself, specifically with a lot of these governments, you notice that they're not necessarily particularly technically sophisticated governments. And it's very interesting to ask yourself why the blogosphere is being targeted as the sort of ultimate sort of example of a bad form of insurgency or a bad form of sort of political comment. It's almost as if weblogs that have this sort of magical, sort of the ultimate boogeyman in terms of authoritarian governments. And I'm wondering whether they are because they're so effective, or they are because it's a new thing. It's kind of like, you know, the moral majority in the UK or the US blaming violence on video nasties or something. It's almost like a sort of the big fad. If you're a dictator, the big fad is to brought down on the blogosphere, and whether or not it's actually because the blogosphere is such an efficient way of spreading political comment, or whether it's actually just because it's this new thing they don't really understand.
I mean, I wouldn't.
Oh, go ahead, Allah.
I don't know. Is that a dealing you? I wouldn't say. I don't think this is like this is correct. I mean, what we're seeing is a general crackdown that affects bloggers less than it affects other forms of media and other activists. The thing is that in the blogosphere you have a mix of people use blogs for journalism, but also for activism, and typically the things are mixed. It's the same person who's doing both, and so it just seems that the arrests are more frequent, or that the harassment, that there is a focus, but it isn't true. That it's just that I would say the new thing is media interest in these stories. You hear more about bloggers being arrested than you hear about other people being arrested, or journalists being arrested.
Ethan, I'm not sure how much you're hearing of that, but do you think governments are right to fear the blogosphere to the degree that they do, or is it a bogeyman that doesn't represent the threat that some of them may feel it is?
I do think for governments that are concerned with controlling information that the blogosphere is a really interesting medium for activists. I think Alech and his friends have demonstrated that it's a very effective space for political activism. I think that one of the things that freaks out a lot of governments is that it's an international space for discussions. This is part of what's so intimidating for the Ethiopian government, is that a lot of the discussion that's happening in the blogosphere is coming from Ethiopians living abroad. There's no consequences for them for what they're saying, and so in many cases they are strident and far more vocal than they would be if they were within Ethiopia. So I do think in some cases the blogosphere is becoming a more open and therefore to a repressive government more dangerous space than some other media. On the other hand, Alex's point that a lot of this has to do with media enthusiasm for it absolutely can't be discounted. It's a really good story. Bloggers get arrested. Bloggers in prison, people blog from prison, as Alech has done. This is something that the media is really interested in, and that in turn amplifies any of these stories. Because the media is paying so much attention to this, because it is a good story, this becomes an amplifier that activists can use to get their causes out to a wider audience. And that in turn is potentially very frightening to a government who need to control information. If bloggers can use this as a way to not just hit local activists, but get bloggers around the world paying attention to their story, you can imagine that being very intimidating and very frightening to an authoritarian government.
Okay, I want to change tack just a little bit here to a story that we covered on the Listening Post last week, which was the Virginia Tech shootings. There were all kinds of issues about the appropriateness of how to use the video. But another aspect of this story was it was the first time really that mainstream media turned to the blogosphere, I think one of the first times, as a source of breaking news. We saw some of that in Lebanon during the Israel-Lebanon war last year. But what happened was a lot of students at Virginia Tech were blogging in real time on sites like MySpace, livejournal.com, and they were shocked and disappointed to find that mainstream media, producers and reporters, were monitoring those sites, seeing what they were saying, in some cases quoting them, and in other cases chasing them down. This was a kind of digital doorstepping. And Patrick Barkham wrote in The Guardian that the hysteria and the reaction, the negative reaction in the blogosphere, showed that bloggers themselves do not understand the public space in which they inhabit. These were not private musings anymore because they were on the blogosphere. In other words, he was saying, you need to grow up. And we're all learning about this. Kevin, do you have any thoughts on that? Is it fair for mainstream media to go there and start in on this digital doorstepping, as they called it?
Well, I'm probably one of the few people who thinks it isn't fair. I think there are very important issues involved, I think, here. It is, of course, legitimate to say that people who were filing to or uploading stuff to MySpace or whatever should have known the rules. There's a little bit of me that thinks that if you think yourself back into the role of the person who was uploading those entries onto those sites, that wasn't necessarily their intention. They may have been wrong-minded about it, but that wasn't their intention. If you could sort of analogize it to pencil and paper, it's a little bit like going into someone's house and picking up their diary. Of course it's public. Once they've written it down, it's public. It's written on paper. It's permanent. And I think there are a whole host of ethical issues here around, I don't think it's a question of shouldn't. It's a question of, I guess, taste, decency. I guess it's human empathy. It's all of those things which, at the end of the day, it is a judgment. Is the story worth, breaching, the normal common human decency to get that story? But I do think there is another side to this, though, which is the extent to which those visits to MySpace and so on did create an understanding of Virginia Tech that probably would not have been possible otherwise. And I think, this is a journalistic justification for going there. For one of the first times, probably in history, we've had the ability to compose the richest possible understanding of what was going through people's minds on the campus, people who knew Cho and so on. It makes me very uneasy, but then again the death knell makes me very uneasy. Journalistically, it's part of the culture. But I do wonder whether there should have been a little bit of not a stop button probably, but a pause button in journalists' mind. Where is the common humanity in this? And am I absolutely certain that although it is true that this person has filed to the Globe, that is what they were intending to do when they filed it?
So Ala or Ethan, if you have any thoughts on that, I'd like to hear them in a second. Just to let the people here know, we're going to open this to questions from the floor, as opposed to statements from the floor, in about 10 minutes or so. Any thoughts from Cairo or from the U.S. on digital doorstepping at Virginia Tech?
Sure, would love to jump in if I can. Part of what's going on with this is that most bloggers, most of the time, are writing for a tiny audience. Most people who are writing, particularly on a site like LiveJournal, may be writing in such a way that it can be read by the general public, but they know most of the time that they're being read by 10 people, most of whom are close friends. And the same thing really goes for MySpace, and frankly the same thing goes for most bloggers who are not really writing to a vast global audience, but are usually writing to a very small group of friends and family. What happened with Virginia Tech was suddenly someone who was really writing about very emotional issues to a very small group suddenly found that those musings were interesting to a global audience, and really just for a couple of days. And this is a phenomenon that we're sort of finding a lot lately in citizen media, which is that people who are not journalists find themselves committing acts of journalism. And for that small moment where someone is viewing news breaking, what they are talking about, what they're reflecting on is suddenly journalistically very, very interesting, even though that person doesn't necessarily see themselves as a journalist. I think what got very tricky with Virginia Tech is that people didn't necessarily embrace that identity. They still saw themselves, in many cases, as writing for friends and family, but suddenly found themselves writing to a much wider audience. And I think as journalists tell stories and use these new tools and sort of use MySpace and blogs and live journalist sources, they're going to have to be increasingly sensitive to the fact that people may be speaking in public, but they expected to be speaking to a much smaller audience than they ended up speaking to.
Allah, do you have any thoughts on this? Because I know that the relationship between the mainstream media in Egypt and the blogosphere is interesting and really rather sophisticated.
Yeah, but I mean, we've never had an example of something disturbing emotionally this way. I mean, but I think I understand a bit of it. I mean, most journalists assume the bloggers want to be journalists, and most bloggers don't want to be journalists at all. and also, and sometimes when journalists are retelling your story, quoting you or whatever, directly from your blog, you are being put in a different context where your speech, your identity, and blogging is very personal, even when it's political, even when it's journalism, and so it's being completely distorted. And I mean, even when that doesn't happen, you'd be worried about it. We've seen. It's very common in Egypt for newspapers and like TV channels to use content from the blog, and it's very common that it happens while events are happening, so they don't get permissions or anything. And every time it happens, there are always people who are angry about it. It's not. I mean, I personally think it's a positive thing, but there is this notion that, yeah, you're speaking to a public, but a smaller public or a specific public, or a cyber public. Sometimes the distinction is important, that you're only speaking to people online in your own context. And I mean, I don't know if this relationship can be mended in any way. I just think it's bound to happen.
I think that one of the things we've got to deal with as a society, as in a sort of internet reading public or whatever, is the rapidly changing standards of media literacy. If you look at, you have to remember, we've only had the internet really as a public thing for the general public for 10 years, if that, and blogging as a mass phenomenon for 3 or 4, again, if that. So all of these things are up in the air. But I would be I think it's a very interesting thing about what Kevin was saying about the live journal stuff and the MySpace stuff with Virginia Tech. If you were to say that you can't use found letters, for want of a better term, then historians and documentarians would be out of business tomorrow. Ken Burns couldn't have made the Civil War without having all of those letters. This is a very, very tried and tested, old-fashioned way of doing it. The fact that the letters that say Ken Burns was using were written on parchment by dead people doesn't really change the point. And so we do have the British Library yesterday announced that they were starting to collect emails to put into the British Library so that future historians can start doing it.
It's too bad we can't get the White House to do the same.
No, exactly. But these are but exactly. But this is a very good point. Is that this is a very, very new medium, and we haven't really worked out the rules for this. But the old rules say that this stuff is not only fair game, it's more than fair game, it's historically really, really valuable documentation. The fact that it's digital and written this morning rather than on parchment and written 300 years ago doesn't really change anything, you know.
Yeah, it would be hard to make that argument. I want to get to Kevin, and I want you to expand a little bit on the limitations as you see them for the blogosphere and journalism. Because it's true that when we were first confronted with the power of the medium and the power of the idea, that a lot of people saw this as some sort of panacea for all of the diseases and ills that journalism was suffering under. So tell us a little bit about why it's not what those people thought it was.
I think they still do. And I mean, you still see it now with, you go to a politician's blogging site and the first thing they tell you is, you know, this is all about engaging with the public. Well, actually it's not. You know, it's no more engaging with the public than knocking on a few doors. I mean, it was really interesting. Here's a, you know, an example of what I mean. David Miliband, you know, was quite an interesting guy. Sorry, David Miliband was quite an interesting guy a couple of weeks ago because we all thought he might be standing for the leadership. And he says on his blogging site, you know, this is the place where I'm going to engage with you, the voters. I'm going to engage face to face. None of this sort of mediated stuff through the press. When he writes a piece about I'm not going to stand for the leadership, where does it go? It goes in the Observer. It doesn't go on his blog. Now, where's the authenticity in that? You know, similarly, when you look at some of the political blogging sites, certainly British political blogging sites, it is very hard to distinguish between Boris Johnson writing as the MP on his blogging site and Boris Johnson writing in the Telegraph. And in fact, he's even got a section on his blog which is articles. You know, so there's even no pretense there at all. But what, and it does pick up on something that we were talking about earlier actually, and it's I just think it's quite interesting listening to the way in which the struggle in authoritarian societies, the struggle to find the civic voice, to find the political voice, to pass first base, if you like, of any mature democracy, and that's to have a working civil conversation. It's humbling and actually quite shaming to hear that going on at the same time as you see what has happened to journalism, particularly in the US and the UK, political journalism, and how over the last 25 years it has simply degraded into something which frankly anyone, blogger or no, could do rather better. But what's really worrying about this, I think, is the speed with which the political blogosphere in the US and here have replicated almost the faults in their political journalism. So political blogging in the States is more or less, of course this isn't true wholly, but it's more or less characterized by being a running commentary on the failings of mainstream political journalism. Here, political blogging is quite literally replicating political journalism. And if you go to some of the more popular political blogging sites, Paul Steyn sites at Guido Fawkes or Ian Dale or whatever, you're seeing the very self-same things happening there, rumour, stories about what's happening to special assistants, you know, who is switching sides in the Labour deputy leadership contest. These are the very things that alienate people from mainstream political journalism. And I just do not believe putting Tony Blair on YouTube, you know, is going to, or any other social networking site, is going to bridge that gap between, you know, what is a fairly decent civil conversation going on in this country, and the link between that and the political conversation. That's my problem with it.
This is the only long-winded point I'll probably make tonight, and that is that, you know, I've been looking at this question of the difference between the American and the British blogospheres. I've lived here for 14 years, and I was wondering why the British blogosphere was a much quieter place, and the Americans were making so much noise, and there was so much vitriol, and there was so much criticism of U.S. media, and the conclusion that I drew, and I'd like you know, some comments on this, is that I think that the blogosphere fills a vacuum wherever it is. And if in Belarus that means one thing, and in the U.S. it's been well documented the failings of mainstream media post 9/11, pre-Iraq, and so the blogosphere has felt that it needs to step in, fill the vacuum, and ask all the tough questions and raise all the issues that the mainstream media in the U.S. for one reason or other, failed to do. I think the fact that the British blogosphere is not such a hostile, brimming place is in fact a bit of, represents a bit of a tribute to mainstream British media, that those same failings did not occur here post 9/11. I'm not saying that the British journalism had a perfect record after that, but they all, my feeling is that it performed a lot better. People were feeling, whether you were reading the Mail on one side, the Guardian on the other, you were complaining about the liberal bias of the BBC, as some people did, you felt that there were voices out there, and there was something for you. And I think that a lot of people in the U.S. felt that there wasn't, and that's why you have so many rabid voices on the blogosphere there. Ben's going to go on this, and Ethan, I don't know if you have any thoughts, and as soon as we're done with this topic, we'll turn it over to questions.
I think with the thing with the American blogosphere, my personal theory on this is that it wasn't to fill a void of reporting that the mainstream media wasn't doing. It was actually to fill a void in finding a scapegoat. I think if you look at the rise of blogging happened almost exactly the second election of George W. Bush. And I think if you look at specifically in the West Coast with the technologists, most of whom are Democratic leaning, it seems to me anyway that America woke up the day after the election and universally reared in horror at 50% of their own country. The people on the left reared in horror that 50% of the country would vote for George W. Bush, and the people on the right reared in horror that the other 50% didn't. And they all went around looking for somebody to blame, and they all said it's the media's fault. So the left said Fox News did it, and the right said, you know, they're being poisoned by the liberal Hollywood or whatever. And if you look at the majority of American political blogs, they're not talking about political ideas. They're not debating policy. They're debating who the next anchor on Fox News is, or why Tony Snow is a bad idea. And it's a continual sort of meta conversation of why American mainstream media journalism is broken and why this is destroying our country, and not what we can do about the health service or healthcare or something like that. It seems to me that an awful lot of American blogging is more trying to sort of find a scapegoat for this madness they find themselves in, whether it's pro or con the current regime.
Let's just
try on one point on this.
Okay, let me hear from Ethan first, then we'll hear from Kevin.
Sure. I'm going to respectfully disagree with my friend Ben on just the issue of timing, which is to say that I actually saw the rise of the sort of political blogosphere in the U.S. as being in the lead-up to those 2004 elections rather than the sort of follow-up to it. And I think part of what happened was a sense of desperately wanting to find a way to participate, understanding just how important these elections were, wanting to have a voice in it. A lot of people who had not been sort of active in U.S. politics previously and wanting to find a way to be active. And I think part of what came out of the Howard Dean campaign and sort of other campaigns trying to use the medium of blogs was discovering that it's very easy to get Americans to be active in an online medium. What's unclear is whether we actually be helpful at all in that medium. And so people are much less willing to sort of go to the political rallies, go to the political meetings, do the sort of heavy lifting that we know actually works in the U.S. political system. But we're much more willing to do things that don't involve any more work than, frankly, sitting at our computers. What came out of this was sort of a realization that the bloggers were very effective at raising money online, but what wasn't really as clear is whether we were actually effective at creating any sort of policy dialogue or pushing any sort of new ideas forward. So I think it's a combination of sort of the laziness of people wanting to find ways to be active without leaving their machines, but also at the same time this sort of desperate sense of things are quite off kilter right now in our country, and wanting to have some way of being involved and having a voice in all of it, even if this is not necessarily proving to be the most effective way to actually have that voice or have that influence.
No, I think that's really important. Because, sorry, is that right? Yeah, I think that's really important because I think one of the most disappointing things I've seen in the last few weeks was seeing a clip of Joe Trippi on Press Video. And Trippi was the architect of the Dean campaign, and I think it's absolutely right to ask yourself, what did that achieve other than that you can campaign online. I mean, where was the ideology? Where was the political action that was going to result from it? Crucially, though, it ended nowhere, and that election was decided by conventional means, a lot of advertising spend, and so on and so forth. Well, but the really disappointing thing about this little clip of Joe Trippi on Press Video was, maybe it's me just being old-fashioned, but I mean it was the relish that social networking sites would reveal more macaca moments. This is the Republican governor, George Allen, a Republican governor, I think, senator for Virginia, who made a racist comment, which, frankly, he should have made, and is the kind of thing that would probably disqualify someone from public office in most electors' mind. But what disturbed me about this was the relish with which Joe was looking forward to the idea of social networking sites delivering more macaca moments. And you kind of think, yeah, that's the problem. That was the problem with conventional political journalism, that it was all about finding the unguarded moment, the guy who didn't come back from his holiday to sit at his desk when the crisis erupted or whatever. And if it's now Joe's idea that American politics is all about, who can eyeball the other guy until the macaca moment has passed, then I really think that is absolutely desperate.
Alaa, would you like to join in on this?
Yeah, but not exactly, since I don't know anything about what you guys are talking about. But it's just that an interesting question came up in my mind, which is if we think of blogging, especially when it comes to journalism, as trying to fill a gap, then the interesting thing would be to look at what gaps aren't being filled. So, for instance, in Egypt, yes, bloggers were filling a lot of gaps in mainstream political discourse and in mainstream media, even the one that is not under control of the state. But we have not seen any coverage of very local issues, very local stories, where that doesn't get covered in mainstream media, and it's not being, and no blogger is telling you what's happening in their neighborhood or what's happening in their town or village or whatever. When I look at Lebanon, there was the way the bloggers treated the war was very different from the way all sorts of mainstream journalism media was treating it. But when they deal with the general politics of Lebanon, there's very little political blogging that is going beyond the typical sectarian debate and discussing actual, again, policy or actual specific political questions that are not directly related to the sectarian debate. And I'm sure, probably with each blogosphere that I'm familiar with, I can identify a couple of black spots that are not being filled by the media, are not being filled by the normal, the more mainstream channels for political debate, and are not being filled by the bloggers. And it would be interesting to think of why, but I have no answers, of course.
Bit of a theme developing, and that is, the same sins, errors, omissions, faults developing in the blogosphere that we see in mainstream media. Politicians naively thinking that they can use the blogosphere as, again, some kind of cure-all for their problems in connecting with youth. It's human nature with new technology. Okay, we'd like to open it up to the floor for questions now, please. Let's start over here. Please, keep your questions short. These are my marching orders, by the way, and it's statements, please, so an interrogation mark at the end of what you have to say, please.
Sue Charman, blogging consultant. I'd like to ask why you're focusing so tightly on political commentary blogs. There are a lot of bloggers out there who do talk about the issues, but they don't label themselves as political bloggers, yet they are fully engaged in the political world because they are talking about, for example, the London ambulance service and the issues with the NHS, or in the case of the NGO that I founded, the Open Rights Group, talking about things like electronic voting and other issues that are fundamental to politics and democracy. Yet when you talk about political bloggers, all you seem to talk about are the people who are replicating political commentary.
Well, just to be fair, I don't think that in a place like Egypt, someone like Allah is replicating political commentary, which is quite the point, which is why he ended up in jail. So that's one reason, because there is a sharp end to this debate. Go ahead, Kevin.
I probably haven't made the distinction as clearly as I could have done. The distinction between the civic conversation, if you like, that underpins politics and politics itself. In other words, what is the connection between the kind of sites you're talking about, which I agree do exist? You know, apologies for not focusing on those as well. What I don't see is that connection between the discussion going on there and how decisions are made in, let's be honest, only the Labour Party or the Tory Party is going to be in government here for the rest of our lifetimes. So where is the connection made between that conversation and the political conversation? That's my point. There used to be, you know, there used to be some semblance of connection 25 years ago when I started in journalism, because that civic conversation then fed into, you know, general management meetings in rooms like this, you know, till 2 in the morning, which went forward as composites and all the rest of it. I don't see that connection, but what worries me is that politicians, many people who are involved in political blogging as well as politicians, are kind of saying, well, no, this is the answer, because look at all this conversation that's going on. You know, this is re-engaging the electorate with politics. I just don't believe it is, and I don't believe it can unless you change politics.
Yeah, I'd like to come in there as well. I totally agree with Sue. I mean, there is a massive class of blogs written by, you know, like you say, the mutual friends, so we know those people, but you know, ambulance drivers and teachers and policemen and soldiers and so on, people on the ground providing government services, all of whom are saying this is broken, this is broken, this is broken, almost universally. The failure, theirs isn't the failure. They are doing an absolutely fantastic job. The failure is in the political class not reading them and not engaging with them, and that's where politics is broken. Because the old excuse would be, if you were the Minister of Health, you'd never get to meet a nurse. So you wouldn't know what it was like to be a nurse. Now you can easily meet a nurse because you can go online and subscribe to the RSS feed of about 20 blogs, right?
But isn't it also the journalists failing for not going there and drawing that to the attention of the politicians? Because that tends to be the route.
Because it's the politician's job. If you're the Minister of Health, why should you wait for Polly Twinneby to tell you why the hospitals are broken? You know, that's where politics is broken.
But traditionally, when they were standing at Speaker's Corner making this point, the politicians weren't there to listen. It was the journalist's job to provide the connection and bring it to their attention.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And you are starting to see this now with certainly with the ones we're talking about, for example, ambulance drivers and soldiers and so on. There's an awful lot of facts. Now, if you look into America, the ruling that the American Department of Defense is trying to pass through now, which is trying to ban American soldiers from blogging, because they don't want that, you know, not only do they not want to listen to the message that's coming through, they don't want the message to exist at all. Now that is absolute proof that politics is broken, compared to, you know, not listening to journalists or something, but not listening to the people you're actually meant to be doing something with. That's absolute proof.
And that development occurred in the last 24 hours, didn't it?
It's been moving backwards and forwards, but yeah.
You know, so we heard about that. Next question. This woman here, and then we'll try Jonathan after this.
Hello, my name is Ginko Kobayashi. I'm a journalist for Japanese online newspaper. My question is, do you think there is a huge disbelief in the form of media to blogging among British journalists or media? Because when I saw lots of people, bloggers and commentators, they set up their own sites on the Guardian website or something like that, and that doesn't happen in Japan. In Japan, blogging is so huge, but I think blogging was born as a sort of alternative media, whatever it is. So spirit is independent and alternative. To be aligned with the major media, it's kind of shameful, I think, in Japan. And do you think there is a distrust in sort of blogging in Britain?
Well, he's the expert.
I would say that there certainly was a distrust, and it's moving rapidly towards the sort of trusted end. If you the work that I started at the Guardian, in fact, the Guardian's blog editor is sat over there typing away, blogging as we speak, who deals with exposed, who deals with mainstream, you know, Guardian columnists every single day. Certainly at the BBC, there's increasing numbers of it started off with 1 or 2 correspondents, and now it's quite a lot of them. There's increasing demand within inside the organisation. I think you can see that people are wanting to do it. Now, whether they're wanting to do it because they have something to say, or they want to do it because it's a cool, shiny toy, or because they want to do it because they think if they don't do it, their boss is going to sack them, I'm not entirely sure as yet. But certainly it is heading towards respectability. It's no longer punk.
Kevin, can I just get you to hold off for half a second? Ethan, you want in on that?
Actually, I want to jump back and actually respond to Sue's, if I can, which is to say that I do think we limit ourselves when we talk just about the political blogs. I actually think that for a lot of the work that we're doing at Global Voices, showing you the blogs of people talking about everyday life, everyday issues, talking about, what are the concerns of a young person in Cambodia, that's deeply political, even though those people aren't necessarily talking at all about political issues. And I think that Ben's point on the mill bloggers in the U.S. is spot on. I mean, having a perspective on what daily life is like for an American soldier who's stationed in Ramadi is one of the most important, pieces of the puzzle that we have as American voters on all of this. And losing that because of the Department of Defense decision is a real problem for us. I would say that, everyone understands that there are bloggers who, can't reveal what's going on because of reasons of operational security. But I think more important in many cases than bloggers who are explicitly taking a journalistic function are these bloggers who are actually showing us what's going on in ordinary life, whether that's, life in a developing world, or whether that's life as an American soldier, and that's a really important perspective for us to get.
No, I agree with that totally, and the point about the trust element, I mean, you can't include all blogs in this, of course, but I think the mainstream media is finding something in blogs that it's always difficult to find, and that's authenticity. And in those areas of explaining the world to each other where, you're not out for on-the-nose verification, what you're trying to do is find an authentic account, someone's experience of whatever. So I think the trust, as Ben says, is definitely moving in that direction because of this, this key thing, authenticity. There is another thing too, actually, and this is the sort of a challenge for the mainstream media. A couple of years ago, there were some riots in Birmingham in the Lascelles Road. The BBC runs a website, or part of the BBC.co.uk website is called Where I Live. We reported that story, everybody reported that story as if it had come from absolutely nowhere. If you went to the Where I Live bit of the BBC.co.uk site and you looked back over the message boards and the blogs on that site, and remember this was, when 2 years ago, so blogging was still pretty junior, you could see the whole story laid out. You could see what local people were saying about the tensions between the West Indian and Asian communities, particular tensions over shops that had changed hands. I mean, the precise elements that about a month later, we were pulling out as the story, what was behind this. And I think that too many mainstream journalists have had bad experiences where they've gone back to a message board or a blog or a social networking site and they've found, God, it was there all along, So I think it's definitely moving in the I trust rather than the I don't trust direction.
To sort of bring the thing back to World Press Freedom Day and the decision by the Department of Defense to stop the mill blogs, the thing that they've got to realize is that censorship doesn't work. And then a really good example of why censorship doesn't work is that all of the insurgents in Iraq are blogging themselves silly. I mean, if you want to see video of American soldiers being shot, it's all over YouTube, it's all over the internet. You can go onto Al-Qaeda's blogs. There are thousands of them. They're pretty well done, right? These guys really know what they're doing. And for the Department of Defense to sort of start shutting their side of the story down just makes themselves look silly.
But they're not exactly shutting down the entire their side of the story. They're stopping the soldiers from their individual thoughts. The Department of Defense says now on liveleak.com, since it started posting video about 2 months ago, they now say that they're out posting video, good news, military video from the American perspective in Iraq, outposting the bloggers, the Iraqi fighters, by a margin of 10 to 1.
But they're outposting it with a byline that says Department of Defense. And the modern sophisticated media consumer, and anybody who goes onto Live Leak is a modern sophisticated...
I'm not arguing with that. What I'm saying is they're not stopping all the postings. They're just stopping the individual postings. Sorry. Oh, go ahead. Is that Ethan?
Yeah. This is the same mistake the U.S. government made with Radio Sawa, and it was sort of an assumption that because the medium was being used, that somehow the U.S. government's message was going to come through it. So, U.S. government sees that YouTube is getting used and then suddenly concludes that, having official U.S. government military video on YouTube is somehow going to be appealing. Again, it's this sort of sense of authenticity that people are finding useful. And it's the fact that it's actual soldiers in the field posting video that people are finding intriguing. The U.S. government could post 100 to 1, but it's very unlikely that that video is going to be viewed as credible or as compelling as the video that's actually coming from soldiers who are trying to show friends and family what they're experiencing in the field.
Allah, if you've got something to say on this or the next question, please feel free to muscle your way in. Jonathan, and then this gentleman.
Yes, Jonathan Charles. And whilst I think obviously blogging can give us an insight into a slice of life that we otherwise wouldn't see, I wonder whether anyone worries about the lack of self-restraint amongst bloggers and whether that stops them sometimes being taken seriously. And I give a couple of examples from my own personal experience. I know full well that if I'm in Iraq and I put something on the evening news, that the following day it will be dissected in minute detail by left and right-wing bloggers, often in highly defamatory terms, which if it was written in a Main Street newspaper I'd probably sue. But because it's in the blogosphere, it seems that people feel they don't have to show the same self-restraint. They are producing a form of journalism, but don't feel bound by the same sort of rules. They don't feel bound by the laws that would prevent defamation, for example, in the United Kingdom. And I worry that if people don't show self-restraint, well, unless you have some maturity, you're not going to be taken seriously, and you can't expect to actually engage in a proper conversation.
I'm not sure that that's sour grapes. I know you're better paid than the bloggers. Does anyone want to pick up on that? I mean, it's a wide point, but...
I mean, it's I worry about the lack of self-restraint. Right, but it stops bloggers being taken seriously in some cases. It's still the cacophony of voices and not mature enough.
You'll also hear a cacophony of voices on the street. And in a way, this is the street, isn't it?
Except it's very public.
Well, yeah, oh, absolutely.
Like a newspaper, for example.
Right, it's amplified.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty public if you're kind of, shouting off in a pub. I mean, I just think it's sort of, it comes with, really. I think it is a kind of it's a global citizen conversation, and I think that you can get hung up about what to call it. Is it journalism? Is it not journalism? Most bloggers think they're not journalists. Well, that's fine by me. I don't think the naming matters. And I think if it is just part of a conversation, if it is part of a, whether you're talking across the planet or across the room by a blog, I think it's hard to sort of start talking about standards. I really do. I mean, whose standards? Your standards, their standards. And although it's, quite distressing to have your stuff taken apart, I can understand it. I just think you've got to live with it because, they're going to be thinking that, okay, it feels a bit like journalism because it's written down and therefore you're reading it. But I don't know. I think you've just got to kind of take a big deep breath.
And actually, let me give you one very good example about which is what I mean by maturity and self-restraint. I received an email after one particular piece I did, and I responded to that email from someone purporting to be a viewer. It then turns up on someone's blog. My email response was then part of their blog, followed by a comment from that person. Now, that's not a mature conversation. They don't say we're going to use your response as part of a discussion.
Yeah, but if you're working for an accountancy firm, you learned 8 years ago that you don't put anything in an email that you're not prepared to see published.
And for that reason, actually, I was very careful in the email. But that doesn't stop the fact that it's not still a mature conversation, is it?
Yeah.
I thought you'd have learned that from all my emails in the Hunt Inquiry.
Yes.
Sorry, hold on. Is that allowed? Can you start again for us, please?
Sorry, yeah, it's precisely because it's not a mature conversation in the sense that journalism is. It's precisely because it's not following the norms and laws that it makes it significant in countries like Egypt. If we choose to abide by libel and defamation laws in Egypt, there will be nothing to do. We'd have no story. We'd be unable to speak about torture. We'd be unable to speak about corruption. So, of course, there is a price to pay for that. You remove this ceiling that is being unfairly put. And maybe in the UK it's better, but if you remove the ceiling, then a lot of immature, silly, and a lot of speech that is essentially just be there to defame someone is going to pass through. But also, you remove all these barriers that journalists have been unable to break through without first trying to engage the parliament and change the laws and so on. And of course, the laws are being controlled by the people who are in power.
Go ahead. We also have some people here who aren't from the UK who might be able to bring some perspective on what the blogosphere is doing or not in their countries. We'd like to hear from you, but go ahead.
Yeah, I greatly agree with Ben's point that the blog really enriches and rapidly changes standards of media literacy. But I do question the ethics of pilfering personal comments, for instance, of the Virginia Tech on their MySpace account. Because if you're familiar with MySpace, you're able to click one particular point and make it set it to private. So if they have 10 friends, quote unquote, and let's say they neglected to select the private setting, and AP is, and therefore just trolling through and therefore extracting that. I really don't necessarily think that's right. And then the second question is about the most influential political blogs sort of covering the madness that America finds themselves in. Philadelphia, which is the 5th largest city, Philadelphia Inquirer, Dan Rubin's Philadelphia Inquirer Blink blog tackles politics in a very dispassionate way, as well as all manners of American life. So I don't feel that you can make such generalizations such as that.
Well, okay, very quickly, both them in order. The media, the question about media literacy and then sort of privacy settings on MySpace is actually sort of answers itself. If MySpace and LiveJournal and all of those things and the social norms and the social niceties that surround those sorts of sites are new and only really understood by people under the age of 25. Not wanting to sound like somebody who's saying, well, you can't really blame the old people, but you can't really blame the old people. If you're the AP national reporter who's only discovered Google 18 months ago, then they screwed up, and they screwed up because they didn't understand the medium. But nobody understood the medium because Chad Hurley was in college 3 years ago. Never mind writing MySpace. So I think that we just have to wait for that sort of stuff to catch up with everybody. In terms of the American political blogs, yes, absolutely, there are going to be certain individuals who are very, very good at it. But I think it's a very telling thing with with American political sites that you can always tell which side they're on. You can name the top 10 American political discussions, not necessarily the ones that are run by professional newspaper journalists that hosted on a newspaper domain, but the non-mainstream media political sites, political discussion sites specifically, and you can always say that's left, that's right, that's left, that's right, that's left, that's right. There isn't one that is neutral. I don't know of a single site that discusses American politics which is down the line neutral.
But it's like that at dinner parties in the U.S. too.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just
So it reflects that.
It reflects that, exactly.
It's true old people don't understand these sites. My kids are on Facebook and MySpace all the time, and my wife calls the site MyFace. Go ahead.
Rosie Goldsmith, BBC Radio. I am interested in the political aspects of blogging, and I do want to ask Abdel specifically, and we hear more and more about the blogs from Iran and Iraq and the Arab world, and I do want to know whether you in Egypt see blogs as the new political opposition, and how far you think this opposition can go.
Allah, did you get that?
So the question is whether blogs are the new political opposition?
And how far it is that you think bloggers can go?
Okay, I don't think bloggers can go anywhere on their own. When we're speaking about political blogging in the sense of actual activism and not just debate, it is not it is not what you can do on the internet, it is what you can do on the ground. And it is not the network on the internet, it is the network on the ground. Which political forces are there? What kind of activists are there? How easy is it to convince or to use the word recruit people and so on? And then when you add the blogosphere and SMS and emails and such technology it doesn't have to be a big, but to a thriving community of activism and of opposition politics and dissent, then these tools become very powerful. But if you don't have that on the ground, then these tools are, I mean, they're almost not good for anything except self-expression and debate, and that alone does not create these realities on the ground. So what we are seeing in Egypt is the rise of a new opposition, is the rise of a new generation of activists, and that is just being reflected on the blog. It is not caused by the blogs. It is just being reflected on the blogs, and of course, it is being empowered by this kind of technology. But I wouldn't say it's the technology is the reason. It's actually probably one of the weakest links. It's turning out to be very easy to intimidate the activist bloggers.
Ethan, do you want to on this?
Sure. Let me just build on my friend's comments there and say that, to a large extent, in a movement like Kafaya, which Alech is involved with, the blogs are sort of the newspapers, and they're where essentially the news on rallies are coming out, where position papers to one extent or another are coming out, where news of the movement is coming out. But there's a whole wealth of other tools, and we can't neglect the mobile phones in this space. We can't neglect good old email, which turns out to be a tremendously effective organizing tool. The one other aspect of these things that I would point out is that what's great about the blog space is that it's not just a local space, it's also an international space. And so inasmuch as the blogs are capable of being sort of newspapers for opposition movements, they're newspapers that aren't just read by the local opposition, they're also read by people around the world who are trying to make sense of the situation there, and also people in the expatriate population who in many countries are very important political actors.
Got another question from the floor. We've got about 10 minutes to go, so we're going to try to speed through 2 or 3 more questions if we can. Go ahead.
Right, thanks a lot. I'm Tanya Lokshina from Damas Center, human rights think tank based in Moscow. And it may sound very naive, and I'm not an experienced blogger. Basically, I use my blog just to promote my articles. I'm also a freelance journalist. But several speakers have spoken about the ethical limitations of the blogging. And I'm just wondering, because for me personally, blogging is something completely private, which really has no ethical limits to speak of, and that's why blogging is so different from professional journalism. So it's about people getting on the web and basically publishing their private diaries, unless they're public politicians, because if they are public politicians, then certainly there are very practical purposes and there are very distinct limitations. But if they are not, how exactly can we apply the ethical dimension to the blogging?
Not sure whether we're talking about ethical limitations or shortcomings there, and there might be a slight difference in the terminology between a private space and a personal space, because there's nothing private about it, but it is highly personal.
I think where the ethics, the necessity to have ethics in what you write comes in is that when you publish it in a public medium like the internet. If you wanted to write something that was private, where you had no ethical, restrictions whatsoever, write it down in a book, put it under your bed, don't let anybody else read it. But as soon as you put it on the internet, if you why are you publishing it if you don't want anybody else to read it? So if you don't want anybody else to read it, if you do want other people to read it, then you have certain ethical, moral responsibilities. It just comes with the thing of having other people reading your thoughts. That's why we have defamation laws, for example, or whatever. So if you don't want to abide by sort of ethical, moral, or legal norms, then don't publish your stuff. I mean, I don't see the conflict there.
Well, we're talking about the
same fundamental difference of opinion as, you know, the Virginia Tech students, bloggers had, and the revulsion with which they had, you know, reacted to being set upon by the mainstream media. Gentleman in the beard, please.
Я буду говорить.
So I'm going to be speaking in Russian and going to be translated into English.
Я думаю, что ситуация может быть очень похожа на то, что происходит в Египте.
So, what is that? Okay. So I'm Oleg Panfilov,
Директор Центра экстремальной журналистики.
Director of the Center of
for Journalism in Extreme Situations.
Okay, from Moscow.
Я хочу сказать о том, как нам помогает блоги собирать информацию о нарушениях прав журналистов.
So I just want to draw your attention that it's very important for us back in Russia, to collect all the information about the journalists and extreme situations all over the world.
Особенно, когда в последние недели было несколько демонстраций оппозиционных партий, во время которых полиция избивала людей.
Let me bring an example. For instance, there were a number of demonstrations in different countries around the world during which the police would arrest the participants of the demonstration and the journalists.
In Russia.
Examples are good, questions are better.
Это не вопрос, это скорее дополнение
Actually, I would like to comment
о том, как нам помогают блогеры, которые сообщают информацию о том, что происходит.
I just want to stress and underline one more time. So for us, it's very important to have the blogging and to have bloggers to put all this information.
В то время, когда существует государственный контроль за информацией, только блогеры нам дают информацию.
Because of the state control over the internet, we are very much limited in receiving this kind of information through the media.
Thank you for the comments. Спасибо большое. Ethan, the blogging and Russia, what are you seeing?
Well, there's a tremendously active Russian blogging scene. We cover this through our editor, Veronika Kukolda, who actually translates a large number of Russian blogs. So for non-Russian speakers, you can follow it that way. One of the really interesting things is that Russian bloggers have really attached themselves to LiveJournal, which generally is referred to as ZhezH within the Russian blogosphere. One of the reasons for this is that LiveJournal makes it possible to constrain your post to a certain audience, and that's really useful if you're concerned about who's monitoring your writing. So there are Russian LiveJournal groups that in some cases are actually closed. They're open only to members of the group. And that's a very, very different dynamic than blogging in the US, blogging in most of the rest of the world, where the assumption is that we're writing for a global audience, we're writing for the general public. It's actually a really interesting thing to think about. If you're writing only for a constrained audience, are you therefore more tempted to be open, to be willing to speak freely in that space?
Thanks, Ethan. Go ahead.
I'm not really an experienced blogger, but what I feel during the last few years that... Okay, my name is Bill, I'm from Greece. What I feel, especially from countries like the Middle East, where the freedom is not like here or in the US, I feel like what my grandfather used to tell me about trying to listen to the radio during the Second World War. So what I wanted to say is that we have a new thing here that is actually more free than working in an organization like BBC or I don't know, Fox News or whatever, and where you can actually talk publicly for the first time after many, many years without using a lot of money, without having to put a lot of money on it. And the thing is, the question is to all of you, and how are we going to protect this? Do we have to put these stories like bloggers are not allowed in, soldiers in Iraq are not allowed to blog anymore, or we are talking about restrictions, or about people in the Middle East getting in jail? Should we, the journalists, put this thing on first level of information all around the world?
Let me
Just throw one thing. This is a genuine comment that I heard. It's not a plug for Al Jazeera, but Wadakhan Fars, the Director General of Al Jazeera, said that that these stories are very important to organizations like Al Jazeera. The Egyptian blogosphere is a big story, and what he wants broadcasters to do is to amplify the blogosphere in places where it's being restricted. So if the Egyptian government or the Tunisian government shut somebody down who had 18,000 readers, it's our job as broadcasters to report that story and give them 1.8 million or 18 million viewers. Do you subscribe to that kind of idea?
Yeah, I do, actually. I think that broadcasters do have a duty here to, it comes back to the point about authenticity, to take what is authentic and to amplify it. And I think that's one of the protections, you talk about protections, that's one of the protections that broadcasters can give. I do think blogging needs protection from a whole host of people. I mean, some of the obvious stuff we've been talking about, the limitations, technical limitations, physical limitations in the sense of people being, locked up. But it also needs, in mature democracies, it also needs protecting from politicians in another sense, that politicians look at social networking sites, blogging sites, and they think, that is the answer. I will get on there. It will solve my problems. And I think, I'm not trying to belittle the dangers that bloggers are in elsewhere, and I think they're very real. But I do think, you overlook at your peril the dangers of Western mature politicians trying to take hold of this medium and believing that this is some solution and some replacement for the kind of politics that, Allah is absolutely right. I mean, unless these networks represent real networks of real people on the ground trying to get involved in developing ideologies and developing political solutions to problems, then it's great. It's a free civic conversation, but what it isn't is politics.
I think in the West, and certainly journalism, and to take we talk a lot about things like censorship and freedom. Today is World Press Freedom Day. We talk a lot about free speech. Whenever you talk about free speech, there's always the same arguments come up, the same moral, ethical arguments which people have been talking about for hundreds of years. The blogosphere, blogging, whatever you want to call it, as Jonathan pointed out today, is actually is the sharp and pointy end of that argument. You have to be able to take all of it as it comes, and you have to be able to defend all of it as it comes. So yes, there's an awful lot of really, really, really nasty, uncivil, deeply unpleasant stuff in the blogosphere. I've spent years trying to develop systems to if you want to see some really nasty stuff, write a blog post about Israel-Palestine, or read Robert Fisk's email. Either way, free speech is free speech is a bitch, right? And the blogosphere is the perfect example of. It's the bitchiest. It's absolutely the bitchiest. And the blogosphere is something that needs to be defended, even though sometimes you might not want to look at it. And so yes, absolutely. The story about the fact that the Department of Defense is preventing soldiers from blogging, I think is an enormous story. It's incredibly huge story, and something that we should be on. The New York Times should be leading with tomorrow morning.
I'm sorry, can you have that point after there's this gentleman I've promised to listen to? It's going to be our last question. So please take it up with Ben immediately after, because he'll be here and I'll hold him in place. Go ahead.
I'd like to get a confusion cleared up on this whole thing. On the one hand, we've been told that we missed the story in the mainstream by not reading the blogs out of Birmingham. On the other hand, we're told that it was a mistake to go to the blogs at Virginia, but it wasn't wrong to go into Virginia with hordes of cameras and things to talk to the same people on the ground. And this puzzles me. Why is it wrong, if you use your proper journalistic discretion, to pick up something that's in the public domain and which in fact is less invasive than large numbers of people descending on the campus and hitting people at their most weak point? And we could have picked up the blogs in Birmingham.
Kevin, you talked about Birmingham, and you were the one, which surprised me as the mainstream media plant on this panel, who was most uncomfortable with the Virginia Tech digital doorstepping.
Yeah, because I think your phrase journalistic discretion is an important one here. And I think you have to look at the nature of what it is that you're intruding into. You know, intrusion is part and parcel of journalism. It happens. You know, it's horrible very often. But I think I was really picking up Ben's point that this is a new phenomenon. It's a new medium. We're not really sure what the etiquette here is. Now, I agree with you. Charging into a campus with, you know, dozens of cameras and dozens of cameras and satellite fans is incredibly intrusive. But we're kind of, you know, regrettably, inevitably, we're kind of used to that as the grammar of news. Now, we're probably immune to it, and we probably should think about that a little more. I, for one, think we probably should. But I'm much more equivocal about dipping into the blogs of Virginia Tech students and the you know, the exchanged messages of Virginia Tech students, because I just don't think we've really got the etiquette of that sorted out. And I don't think we're, you know, if you see a camera coming towards you and there's been an incident behind it, you know what it's about. If you're posting something to what is in half of your mind a private space, but you kind of know it's a public space, I'm not sure we've quite got that clear, you know, what the etiquette, what the ethics of that are. And that's where the journalistic discretion, I think, comes in. You used the phrase yourself, and I think that's the thing that has to be applied here.
You know, it takes time for these things to evolve, and you know, I think a lot of people who write on blogs assume that they probably haven't heard of it, but they assume they're writing under the Chatham House rule. But the Chatham House rule took a long time to evolve. You know, it took Chatham House quite a while to think it up, and nobody can remember it. And the fact there's only one of them. But you know, so it's a difficult thing. It takes a while.
I think we've lost Allah, but Ethan, a final thought from you, because I kind of dig the fact that we're talking about discretion of blogosphere's Virginia Tech on World Press Freedom Day. Go ahead.
I think a lot of this is about learning how to read in this new medium. And, you know, the questions of credibility have come up, and that's a question about learning how to read blogs, learning how to look not just at the post of what someone's saying, but look back at the entire history of what they've written over some period of time and decide whether they're credible or not. I think journalists need to do similar things in the Virginia Tech situation. When you're encountering this blog, look back and try to figure out who is this author actually writing for. Are they writing because they expect to have wide readership? Do they expect to have this actually looked at by a wider audience? Or are they writing really just for family and friends? If they are, at that point, then there is the question about whether you're sticking the camera in someone's face in their moment of grief. But this is a new medium, and we're all learning what it means to write in this space. But even more than that, we're learning what it means to read in this space. If anything, I think the benefit of blogs is that it's teaching us all to be much more careful readers, to think about who the author is and to think about what the authorship of something means.
Ethan, thank you very much for talking with us today. This is an enormous topic. I mean, you can't deal with it in an hour and a half. I mean, it's immense. The longer you look at it, it just grows. It's kind of like the Borg in Star Trek. It's organic and just reaches everywhere. It's immense and difficult to get your head around. We hope that you've enjoyed the conversation. We thank you for your questions. I want to thank Kevin Marsh and Ben Hammersley and Ethan in the U.S. and Allah as well, who I think we've lost. If you have a couple of points you'd like to make with the panelists who are here, or perhaps even, I don't know if Ethan's willing to stay online for a minute or two. Maybe someone will bark down a microphone to you. Please do. And we'll see you in the bar.